Micah, being the prophet of the downtrodden and exploited people of the Judean society, he prophesied during the time of a period of a whole great social injustice, and boldly opposed those who imposed their power upon the poor and the weak for selfish ends. As he preaches to the people, Micah that Andy used to ask, God, what do you want from me? And we could even ask as a church, God, what do you want from us? And so as we look at this morning, of course Micah is a bit more poetic. What does the Lord require of us is how he puts it. But the answer comes as a threefold response that we see in verse 8. And it begins with, first of all, act justly. Act justly. Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. Luke, can you take me a slide further? There you go. Act justly. Look at Micah chapter 6, verse 11, if you will. Hang on to that verse, because that act justly, in other words, act with fairness, act with honesty, act with integrity. Micah had a special concern for justice, and primarily because he saw so little of it. What God requires of us is that we do what is right and fair in our relationship with other people. That's what he's asking from us. Justice involves the sense of a standard of equality among people. It can be as simple as being honest, and even the smallest of routine business transactions. It can, in Micah, the prophet complained about the person who uses dishonest scales. Dishonest scales with a bag of false weights. There in Micah chapter 6, verse 11. Look at it. Shall I acquaint someone with dishonest scales with a bag of false weights? Now, when we look at that, we think, well, there's many ways. Oftentimes we feel like we get ripped off from other people, either through a business transaction or something. You know, I always double check those cashiers, and I'm not blaming them, but oftentimes those sales that they have, they don't put them in the system, and then a lot of times you get rung up the regular price, and you go, and if you're not paying attention, you won't catch it. And I think to some extent, and I've told managers before, I've been in business, and I've told them, I said, you know, that's cheating. That's cheating. Well, we just forgot to put it in the computer. Well, your laziness and unthoughtfulness is really cheating people. And you got to get that, and that's what Micah's trying to get across, that we ought to be diligent in all of our transactions in dealing with people. There's an old saying, honesty is the best policy. My mom and used to remind me of that all the time. But for the Christian, that slogan should be, honesty is the only policy. The only policy, because this is a constant theme in all of Scripture, that we are called, you and I as Christians are called to be people of fairness and integrity in whatever we do, in all of our dealings. God expects that of us. If we look at Psalms 51, verse 6, it's still not working, Luke. I think my battery's out. Oh, okay. Psalms 51, verse 6. You desire truth in the inward parts. You desire truth in the inward parts. Now, what is that trying to tell us? Well, if I look in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, it says, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring all the issues of life. We must settle it deep in our hearts to be people, first of all, of integrity, and to be on guard in the battle to act justly. Because I promise you, sometimes, just like the cashier, not being her fault. But you and I, as called as Christians, we need to be diligent to make sure that there's no mistakes. Micah tells us 3 things that God requires of us. One is to act justly. And you can say, well, easy task. But it is hard to make acting justly a reality. It really is. You have to work at it. We are a nation of, and they are not all on a large scale, but we do the cheating on small scales that never make the headlines. A lot of people, when they fill out their taxes, we think, well, I don't need to add that. I don't need to put this down. They'll never know about that. We do the cheating on small scales. Sometimes we cheat our neighbors. If we can swindle an employee or steal from our employer, oftentimes people will naturally do it without giving it a second thought, not calling it stealing even. But God requires all of us, no matter who we are. Think about what happened to employees through Enron years ago. Think about some of the things that you and I know about, where on a large scale, or it could be a simple individual transaction, but we are called, no matter what the circumstances, to act justly. Act justly. God requires that of all of us. The second point this morning is love mercy. Love mercy. That's the second thing that God requires of us, is that we love mercy. Because we're also to fill our hearts with compassion and kindness towards everyone, especially to each other. The Hebrew word that Micah uses here is translated as mercy is a rich one, because it's used variously as mercy, tender mercies, loving kindness, steadfast love, many of those standards. It is a word that most often is used to in a covenant sense, involving the attitude of two parties who are in a conventional relationship with one another. In relation to God's mercy, it is used most often when talking of His grace, or of His unexpected kindness. Like oftentimes I will pray and thank God for His love, grace, and mercy. But we notice that the requirement here is not that we have mercy, but that we are to love mercy. I want you to think about that for just a moment. There's a big difference between the two. One way of describing the difference is to say that we don't just do acts of kindness from the sense of out of obedience or compulsion, but we do them and should do them out of an act of love. Random act of kindness was a big theme about 20 years ago. Came out and said, hey, I used to have a bumper sticker, do one random act of kindness today. In other words, do one random act of love today. Today. There seems to have been an emphasis in Jesus' teaching on the idea of